Hello everyone, I'm Grandpa Sen. I'm so glad you're here. I know you've come for a calming story to help you relax and get ready for a peaceful sleep. If you could, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It's always wonderful to know how far and wide our stories travel. Now take a deep breath, find a comfy spot, and get ready to unwind. I'm here to help you find that perfect calm and peace for a restful night. Let's get started. Story 1. The Haunting at Hollow Creek. It was a cold and eerie evening when Olivia and her younger brother, Max, arrived at their grandmother's house by Hollow Creek. The air had a strange stillness to it, one that sent a shiver down Olivia's spine as she stepped out of the car. The house, as usual, looked old and weathered, its gray wood and creaky shutters giving off an unsettling aura. The once lively garden had grown wild, the overgrown vines curling around the windows like fingers, reaching out to the night. The sky was a deep shade of indigo, with only a sliver of the moon peeking through the clouds, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Grandma's warnings echoed in Olivia's mind. She had always told them about the strange happenings around Hollow Creek, the whispers in the trees, the unnerving flicker of lights late at night, and the eerie feeling that clung to the air. But as much as Grandma had cautioned them, Olivia had never quite believed the stories. Her brother Max, on the other hand, had always been the curious one, the one to question everything, to challenge the tales of ghosts and dark forces. "We'll be fine, Olivia," Max said, slinging his bag over his shoulder as he walked ahead toward the front door. His voice was confident, but Olivia noticed a slight hesitation in his step. He was trying to appear brave, but even he couldn't ignore the strange energy that surrounded the place. Olivia hesitated, glancing at the dense woods that surrounded the house. The trees were tall and skeletal, their branches twisting into the dark sky like bony hands. The path to the creek seemed even darker than usual, as though it had been waiting for them, calling them closer. She could almost hear the faint rustling of leaves, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. Grandma had always insisted that they never go near the creek at night. "It's not safe," she would say, her voice trembling as she described the chilling stories that had been passed down in their family for generations. The spirits, she said, came alive after dark, walking the banks of the creek, searching for souls to drag into the water. Olivia had always dismissed these tales as nothing more than superstition, but as she stood there looking at the woods, something felt different this time. There was a sense of foreboding in the air, a chill that crept beneath her skin, making her feel like she was being watched. Max, sensing her unease, turned and grinned. "Come on, Olivia. Don't be such a scaredy cat. We're just here for a visit. Grandma's stories are just stories." Olivia hesitated, but then she forced a smile. "Yeah, I know. Just feels weird, that's all." But Max was already heading inside. He threw one last glance at her, and she followed, though her footsteps were slower. The house was dimly lit, casting long shadows in the hallway. The smell of old wood and lavender filled the air, and Olivia found a strange comfort in the familiar scent, even though the place felt colder than it used to. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet echoed through the empty rooms. They settled into their rooms, and as the night deepened, the house grew quieter. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows and sending the branches of the trees scraping against the house like fingernails against glass. Olivia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sounds of the house settling around her. She kept thinking about the creek, the stories Grandma had told, the warnings. The coldness she had felt in the air, it all seemed so real now. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Max, on the other hand, was fast asleep. He always had that ability to fall asleep anywhere, anytime. Olivia envied him for it. She tossed and turned, finally giving in to the restlessness gnawing at her. She glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight. That's when she heard it, a faint sound, like a whisper. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. The whisper was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew clearer, more distinct. Olivia listened, straining her ears. She could hear the words now, though they made no sense. Come to the water. The voice was a low murmur, as if carried on the wind. Olivia's pulse quickened. She didn't know what to make of it. It could be the wind, she told herself. Or maybe it was just her imagination running wild. But then the whisper came again, louder this time, and there was no mistaking it. Come to the water. Her breath caught in her throat. Olivia stood up from her bed, her legs shaky. She walked over to the window and pulled back the curtains, just enough to peer outside. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, and beyond the trees, she could see the outline of the creek. The water appeared still, unnervingly still, as though it were holding its breath. The moonlight reflected off its surface, creating an almost hypnotic shimmer. But there was something unnatural about it, something that made Olivia's skin crawl. A shiver ran down her spine. She knew she should stay inside, lock the doors, and ignore whatever was calling her. But something deep inside her urged her to go, to find out what the voice wanted, against her better judgment. Olivia quietly opened the window and slipped outside. The night air hit her like a cold slap, sending goosebumps across her arms. The fog had begun to roll in thick and heavy, swallowing the world in an eerie blanket. She made her way toward the creek, her footsteps muffled by the soft ground beneath her feet. As she drew closer, the whispers became more distinct. They were no longer just words, they were pleading, beckoning her forward. Olivia, come closer. The secret is waiting. The moon was obscured by clouds, and the only light came from the faint glow of the house behind her. The trees around the creek creaked in the wind, and the branches seemed to bend, almost as though they were reaching toward her. Olivia could feel the weight of the air around her. It felt wrong, thick with something she couldn't explain. She stopped at the edge of the creek, staring at the still water. There was no movement, no ripples, no signs of life. But the whispers didn't stop. She stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the water calling to her. It surfaced dark and uninviting, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. There was something in the depths, something waiting for her. Her mind raced. She needed to turn back, but her body refused to obey. The whispers were growing louder now, clearer than ever. Come closer. The voice was all around her, wrapping around her like a rope, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Her breath quickened as she took another step forward, and then suddenly she heard a noise behind her, a rustling in the bushes. Olivia spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She was not alone. Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat as she turned toward the sound. The fog coiled around her ankles, cold and suffocating. The forest was alive with an eerie hum, the trees creaking as if whispering to each other, secrets hidden in their twisted branches. Behind her, the silhouette of a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, hunched, and dripping with black water that pooled at its feet, dark as night. The air turned glacial, an unnatural chill seeping into her bones as her pulse quickened, roaring in her ears. Every step she took felt like she was sinking deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her heart hammered in her chest, thudding in her throat as her eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight, revealing more of the figure that towered before her. It was a woman, or what remained of one. Her body was emaciated, skin stretched thin over protruding bones. Her tattered dress, once possibly beautiful, now clung to her skeletal frame. Hanging from her shoulders like a rag, the fabric embroidered, with faded gold thread that seemed to writhe and shift like serpents in the gloom. Her face was gaunt, hollowed out as if the life had been drained from it long ago. But it was her eyes glowing cobalt blue that sent a shock of terror coursing through Olivia's veins, hollow pits of light that seemed to see straight into her soul. The woman's left arm jutted out at an unnatural angle, as if it had been shattered and rebuilt countless times. Twisted by some dark force, her hair, long and matted, hung around, her face in damp tendrils, black water cascading from it like a stream of liquid darkness, pulling around her feet and making the earth beneath her roil with an unnatural energy. Olivia stood frozen, her feet planted in the mud, as the spectral figure tilted her head to the side, her gaze locking onto Olivia with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. There was no emotion in those eyes, only an ancient hunger that stretched back through time, beyond memory. "You shouldn't be here," the spirit rasped, her voice like ice cracking underfoot, hollow and distant, but unmistakably human. Every word felt like a blade scraping against her skin. Olivia's throat constricted, the cold air pressing down on her chest. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her legs refused to move. The fog around her seemed to thicken, the dark mist curling around her ankles, tightening like invisible shackles. The creek's whispers erupted into a cacophony, a chorus of hundreds of voices overlapping, their words indistinguishable, a cacophony of pleading, mourning, and screaming that echoed from every direction. Behind the spectral woman, the creek began to churn, its dark waters writhing as if alive. The surface of the water broke, revealing skeletal hands that rose from the depths, clawing and grasping at the air with bony fingers. They reached toward her, toward Olivia, their grasp long and insatiable. "Max!" Olivia screamed, her voice raw with terror. She turned to run, but the ground beneath her feet began to shift. Like the earth itself was changing shape, turning against her, roots thick and gnarled erupted from the soil, twisting around her legs with the speed of vipers, holding her fast. The spirit moved closer, her gnarled claws slashing through the fog with terrifying precision. Olivia twisted her body, but one of the claws grazed her shoulder, the cold seeping through her skin and into her very bones. A searing, icy chill spread through her veins, and she cried out in pain, collapsing to her knees as the world spun around her. The weight of the air pressed in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, sharper, clawing at her sanity. She could feel the black water crawling through her skin, wrapping around her soul. "Olivia!" Max's voice cut through the chaos. His presence was like a lifeline. He burst through the underbrush, a rusted shovel in hand, swinging it wildly at the spirit. The shovel passed through her like smoke, the metal passing harmlessly through her form, but the distraction was enough. The roots loosened their grip around Olivia's legs, and she scrambled free. "Run!" Max shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her toward the house behind them. The forest seemed to come alive. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches lashing out like whips. catching at their clothes and tearing at their skin. Thorns, sharp as needles, tore through their clothing, digging into their arms as they sprinted. The spirit's laughter echoed behind them, cold and cruel, like the sound of 1,000 souls trapped in agony. You cannot outrun the creek's hunger, the spirit shrieked, her voice warping with madness. It was no longer a plea, it was a promise, the declaration of fate. The siblings skidded into the house, breathless and trembling. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud. The sound of their heartbeats pounding in their chests like war drums. Max shoved an old dresser in front of the door, his hands shaking uncontrollably. What the hell was that? He gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Olivia panted, clutching her frostbitten shoulder, the skin already turning a sickly shade of blue. The cold radiated from the wound like an infection, and she felt the weight of it bearing down on her. Grandma's stories, they're real, she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. Her thoughts were scattered, but the terror clawing at her heart wouldn't let her think clearly. She's one of them, the spirits from the creek, and she knows us. A thunderous crash shook the house. The windows rattled violently as the spectral woman's face materialized in the glass, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile full of malice and unearthly hunger. Your grandmother thought she could hide you, the spirit hissed, her voice like 1,000 broken voices warping in the wind, but the creek always claims its due. Max's eyes widened as he looked at Olivia. The boathouse, he blurted, his mind racing. Last summer, I saw Grandma bury something there. A journal, maybe. She kept muttering about anchors and breaking the cycle. Olivia's mind spun, but the words fell into place, piecing together the fragments of Grandma's cryptic warnings. If Grandma left clues, that's where we'll find them, she said, determination creeping into her voice. But we have to go now. We don't have much time. With no other choice, they bolted out the back door. The night had become even darker. The forest now an impenetrable maze of twisted shadows. The air had thickened with an almost tangible malice, the trees now oozing black sap, as if the forest itself were feeding on something dark and ancient. The path to the creek was choked with thorny vines that writhed beneath their feet like snakes. Ahead, the boathouse loomed, sagging under years of neglect. Its roof was crooked, the walls splintered and decaying. The musty stench of mildew and rot filled the air as they entered, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. Max kicked aside old fishing nets, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and pried up a warped floorboard with the shovel. Beneath it, there was a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen with dampness, as though it had been waiting there for them all this time. Olivia snatched the journal from the floor. Flipping through its pages, her grandmother's frantic handwriting filled the pages, the ink smeared in places as if written in haste. The locket is a prison. Eleanor's bones anchor her to this place. The creek demands a soul every 50 years. But I refuse to let it take my Clara. Eleanor, Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. That spirit, she's family. Before she could read more, a deafening crash interrupted her. The boathouse door exploded inward with a violent force, splintering into pieces. The spectral woman surged inside, her claws slashing at the air. Max tackled Olivia behind an old rowboat just as the spirit's strike splintered the wood above them. They could feel the chill of the air turn colder, sharper. Give me the journal, the spirit demanded, her voice splitting into static like a broken radio. You do not deserve her secrets, Eleanor, Olivia shouted, clutching the journal to her chest. You're Eleanor Blackthorne, Aren't you? Grandma wrote about you. You sacrificed yourself in 1893 to save your sister. The spirit froze, her eyes flickering with something other than rage. For a moment, there was a flicker of humanity in the cobalt fire of her eyes. Lies. She betrayed me. She let the creek take me. No. Olivia cried out, thrusting the journal open to reveal a sketch of a young woman in a 19th century gown. Eleanor, smiling beside her sister. You volunteered. Grandma tried to protect your memory. But the creek twisted you. It feeds on sacrifice. But we can stop it. Eleanor's form shuddered, the black water dripping from her dress slowing, revealing patches of pale skin beneath the bones. She whispered, under the willow, burn them, and the locket. Story 2. The Last Dance of the Spirits. The grand hall of Blackwood Manor stood silent, frozen in time. Dust-covered chandeliers loomed above, their crystals dulled by decades of neglect. Moonlight filtered through the massive stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows onto the marble floor. The once opulent ballroom, where laughter and music had once flowed like fine wine, now carried only the weight of forgotten whispers. Eleanor Montgomery shivered as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing through the vast chamber. She clutched her coat tighter on her frame, glancing at the ornate ceiling where faded murals depicted celestial beings locked in eternal walls. The air smelled of aged wood and something faintly floral, as if the scent of past dances still lingered. You really shouldn't be here, a voice murmured behind her. Eleanor spun around. Standing in the doorway was James Calloway, a historian and self-proclaimed skeptic. Though his cautious stance betrayed a deeper unease, he adjusted his glasses and stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. I had to see it for myself, Eleanor said. Her voice hushed. James sighed. The Blackwood Masquerade. You believe the stories, believe? Eleanor's lips curled into a half smile. I grew up with them. She stepped toward the center of the room, trailing her fingers over a forgotten grand piano. Every year, on the anniversary of the final ball, the spirits return for one last dance. It's been over a century since the Blackwood tragedy, but some say the echoes of that night never truly faded. James exhaled sharply. A legend, a ghost story told to keep trespassers away. And yet, here you are, Eleanor mused, tilting her head. James hesitated, glancing at his watch. Midnight was near. The story was infamous. On October 31st, 1901, Lady Eleanor Blackwood had hosted a masquerade ball of unparalleled grandeur. The elite of society had gathered, dressed in lavish silks and gilded masks, dancing beneath chandeliers that shimmered like constellations. But as the final waltz began, the music twisted into something unnatural, and the guests, every last one, vanished without a trace. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just a ballroom left eerily untouched. Eleanor knelt, running her fingers over the marble, as if expecting to feel the echoes of that night beneath her palm. They say Lady Eleanor still waits for her final partner. James rolled his eyes but said nothing. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then faintly from the grand piano, a single note rang out. Eleanor's breath hitched. She met James's gaze. That was just before he could finish. The piano played again. 2 notes, then 3, then a melody slow and haunting. James stepped back. That's not possible. But Eleanor wasn't looking at the piano anymore. Her eyes were locked on the chandeliers. The crystals, dull friars, had begun to glow. A soft luminescence spread across the room as candle sconces flared to life, their flames flickering in an unseen breeze. A hush fell over the hall, like the intake of breath before a song. And then they appeared. Shadows took shape. Figures emerged, translucent at first, then solidifying into elegant men and women dressed in the finery of another era. Their masks shimmered, gold and ivory, hiding the faces beneath. The whispers of silk and the faint clink of glass filled the air. The masquerade had returned. Elena's heart pounded. She reached for James, but he was frozen, his eyes wide. Lady Eleanor stood at the far end of the ballroom, her sapphire gown flowing like liquid midnight. A golden mask covered the upper half of her face, but her eyes sharp and knowing pierced through the veil of time. She lifted a hand. The music swelled. The spirits began to dance. It was mesmerizing, the way they moved, effortlessly gliding across the floor, their feet never truly touching the ground. It was as if they existed between moments, suspended in a memory that refused to fade. Elena felt a pull, an invisible thread tightening around her heart. Her feet itched to move, to step into the dance. Her pulse matched the rhythm, her breath syncing with the waltz. Lady Eleanor extended her hand further, beckoning. James grabbed Elena's wrist. "No, we have to go now." "But, Elena," his voice was raw, urgent. "Look at their faces." She turned, and for the first time, she truly saw them. The dancers weren't smiling. Their eyes, those visible behind the masks, were empty, hollow voids reflecting nothing but darkness. Their movements, though graceful, were not their own. This wasn't a celebration. It was a prison. A pulse of cold air slammed through the ballroom, and the spirits all turned in unison. The music faltered, discordant. Elena felt it, then a weight settling over her, pressing into her chest. The room tilted, the walls stretched, elongating into an endless corridor of shadows, and candlelight. The floor beneath them darkened, shifting into a swirling abyss. Lady Eleanor stepped forward. "Stay," she whispered. "Dance with us." James yanked Elena backward. "Run!" They bolted. The ballroom stretched before them, the exit impossibly far behind them. The spirits surged forward, their waltz turning into a frantic chase. The music rose to a fever pitch, the violin screeching. Elena's breath came in sharp gasps. The air grew thick, pressing against her like unseen hands. Then James tripped. Elena skidded to a halt. James, his ankle was cut, no grip. Shadowed fingers clawed at his leg, pulling him down. Elena lunged, grabbing his arms. She pulled with everything she had, but the spirits were stronger. James's fingers began to slip from hers. "No, no, no," she cried. Lady Eleanor stood over them now, her expression unreadable. "One must stay," she murmured. Elena's vision blurred. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't lose him. A thought struck her. Desperate, reckless, she released James and grabbed Lady Eleanor's hand instead. The spirits halted. The ballroom shuddered, the very fabric of the curse trembling. "You seek a partner," Elena gasped. "Take me," James screamed. "No," the spirits whispered among themselves. "The chandelier is dimmed." Lady Eleanor tilted her head, considering. Then she smiled. The shadows released James. He tumbled back, gasping. Elena turned to him, her heart pounding. "Go," James scrambled to his feet. "I won't leave you. You have to." She took a step back. "Tell the world, break the cycle." The music resumed, soft and sorrowful. The last dance had begun. Lady Eleanor twirled Elena into the waltz, their gowns swirling like waves. The ballroom blurred, fading into golden light. James's scream was the last thing she heard before the doors of Blackwood Manor slammed shut. The heavy doors of Blackwood Manor slammed shut with a deafening finality, sealing Elena inside. Jeans pounded against the wood, his desperate cries swallowed by the oppressive silence of the night. The stained glass windows shimmered, shifting colors like a living entity, obscuring any glimpse of the ballroom beyond. Inside, Elena was already moving. The moment her hand had touched Lady Eleanor's, she had felt a thin, invisible thread winding around her soul, pulling her into the walls. The music consumed her, its haunting melody threading through her veins like a spell. Her feet glided effortlessly, each step guided by an unseen force, her body no longer her own. The ballroom around her gleamed with an unnatural vibrancy, as if time itself had unraveled to weave her into the past. She danced, the spirits swirled around her in a mesmerizing blur, their movements elegant yet tinged with sorrow. Behind their masks, their hollow eyes shimmered with longing, trapped in an endless cycle of repetition. As she spun, she caught glimpses of the world beyond, the ballroom, flashes of history folding in on itself. The chandeliers flared, illuminating figures long lost to time, their laughter echoing through the grand hall. But beneath the illusion of beauty, something dark lurked, a whisper coiled through the air. She is one of us now. Elena's heart pounded. No, she refused to become a shadow of the past, an echo in an endless masquerade. Summoning all her will, she fought against the rhythm, pushing back against the invisible force that sought to claim her. Her limbs trembled as she struggled to break free, but Lady Eleanor's grip tightened. "The dance is eternal, child," Eleanor murmured, her golden mask gleaming. "You cannot leave." Outside, James refused to accept that. Frantic, he searched the manor's exterior for another entrance. There had to be a way in, a way to pull Elena out before she was lost forever. The legend spoke of the final waltz, of spirits bound to Blackwood Manor, but if there was a curse, there had to be a way to break it. His eyes fell on the Blackwood family crest carved into the stone archway, a serpent entwined with a rose, and beneath it a name, Eleanor Blackwood. The journals, the ones he had skimmed through in preparation for this trip, something about her last words, a single phrase recorded by her maid before the Blackwood masquerade had faded into legend. "The dance will end with fire." James's breath hitched. Fire! He spun, scanning the overgrown gardens, his mind racing. If Eleanor had been the first to fall to the curse, perhaps her presence was its anchor. Destroying that anchor could sever the spirit's hold over Elena. With renewed urgency, he dashed toward the old carriage house, where supplies had been stored for decades. Inside, beneath dust-covered sheets and broken furniture, he found what he needed, a rusted oil lantern. The wick was brittle, but it would have to do. Back in the ballroom, Elena was losing her battle. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision blurring. The walls rippled like water, the edges of reality fraying. She could feel herself fading, becoming less solid, her body no longer entirely her own. Her fingers trembled as she gripped Lady Eleanor's hand, struggling to hold on to herself. And then a blinding light burst through the stained glass windows, followed by the unmistakable scent of smoke. The music faltered. The spirits hesitated, their movements stuttering. The glowing chandeliers flickered, the magic within them wavering. Lady Eleanor's head snapped toward the windows. "No," she hissed, her grip tightening painfully. "He cannot." A roar of fire surged through the manor. James had set the oil lantern ablaze, hurling it through the grand entrance. Flames licked up the ancient walls, consuming the drapes, devouring the wooden beams that had stood for over a century. The manor groaned, as if the very structure could feel its demise. The spirits screamed. Elena gasped as the spell holding her in place shattered. She stumbled back, her body her own again, her breath rushing into her lungs like she had been drowning. Lady Eleanor's form flickered, her golden mask cracking as the fire reflected in her hollow eyes. "You do not understand," she whispered, stepping toward Elena. "The dance is all we have. Without it, we are nothing." Elena's heart clenched. "Then be free." The inferno raged, devouring the cursed ballroom. The spirits, once bound by the music, began to unravel. Their forms wavered, breaking apart like mist in the morning sun. One by one, they turned to Elena, their eyes once empty filling with something new. Relief. Lady Eleanor was the last to fade, her expression unreadable. As the flames reached her, she lowered her mask, revealing a face untouched by time. "Thank you," she whispered, before vanishing into the embers. Elena didn't have time to process it. The ceiling cracked, beams crashing down around her. "Elena!" James's voice cut through the chaos. He was at the entrance, the doors forced open by the collapse of the framework. "We have to go," she ran, dodging falling debris, the heat searing her skin. The moment she crossed the threshold, James grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the inferno as Blackwood Manor gave one final, shuddering groan and collapsed. The fire raged through the night, consuming the haunted legacy of Blackwood Manor, until all that remained were smoldering ruins and the first light of dawn. Elena and James sat on the grass, breathless, watching as the last embers flickered out. The air was thick with smoke, and the scent of something ancient finally put to rest. James exhaled. "It's over." Elena wasn't sure. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her, heavy and unshakable. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against something smooth. She pulled it out, a golden mask, and touched by the flames, her breath hitched. She turned to James, her voice barely above a whisper. The dance ended, but the spirits, she didn't finish the thought. James stared at the mask, then at the ruins, and then up at the sky where the first streaks of morning light cut through the night. The air was silent for now. Story 3. The Tapestry of Time. The thread of fatigue whirled around David Cunningham had always been one of certainty in facts, dates, and neatly organized events. As a young historian, he spent his days in the dusty corners of libraries, surrounded by ancient texts that spoke of the past in cold, unyielding terms. History, in his view, was a series of undeniable truths. It was only in the margins, in the footnotes of great books, that one could occasionally sense whispers of something beyond the ordinary, something mysterious. David had always been captivated by these whispers. As a child, he was drawn to the old books of his family's estate, where time seemed to hang in the air like an invisible fog. The place smelled of dust and leather, its shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten stories. But nothing intrigued him more than the rumors surrounding a mysterious artifact, a piece of fabric so old, so intricately woven, that it was said to contain secrets capable of changing the very fabric of time itself. It was during a trip to Venice, at a small, obscure marketplace tucked away in a shadowy alley, that David encountered the tapestry. The old man selling it seemed as ancient as the threads that wove it together. His face was a wrinkled map of years lived in silence, his eyes gleaming with a secret knowledge. The tapestry was displayed on a nearby stall, its rich blue hue glowing faintly under the harsh sunlight, catching David's attention immediately. The intricate patterns woven into the fabric seemed to shift with the angle of light, as though they were alive. "You're interested in this one?" the old man asked, his voice low and gravelly. David nodded, his eyes unable to look away from the tapestry. The fabric was adorned with strange, geometric patterns, unlike anything he had ever seen in historical textiles. But it wasn't just the design that drew him, and it was the feeling it gave him, an unnerving sensation that this was no ordinary piece of cloth. It felt important. The old man saw David's hesitation and smiled, a slow, knowing smile. It's a very old piece. It's been passed down through generations. Not many people understand its true value, he said cryptically. David's curiosity won over his caution, and despite the high price the man demanded, he bought it. Little did he know, this purchase would soon take him on a journey that would unravel the very fabric of reality itself. Back at his study in London, David laid the tapestry on his desk. The room was cluttered with books, old maps, and artifacts, his personal sanctuary, a space where time itself seemed to slow. But as soon as he placed the tapestry on the desk, the air in the room felt heavier, as though the very atmosphere had changed. His fingers hovered over the woven patterns, tracing the lines of the intricate design. There was something about the tapestry that felt wrong. It was as though the threads themselves were shifting, moving just beneath the surface. The more he studied it, the more the patterns seemed to pulse with an eerie life. Suddenly, David's breath hitched. The tapestry began to glow. At first, it was a subtle shift, a faint glimmering of light that emanated from the fabric. But then, as David's hand brushed across the center of the tapestry, the light flared brightly. His heart pounded in his chest. The threads, once static, now seemed to shift and bend, as though they were unraveling before his eyes. He stumbled back, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Was it some sort of optical illusion, or was the tapestry truly alive? As David backed away from the desk, the glow intensified, and the air around him seemed to ripple. The room felt colder, and the walls began to distort, elongating and shrinking in a dizzying dance. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling, but before he could call for help, the tapestry suddenly emitted a sharp, high-pitched sound. The room spun around him, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to give way. Everything went black. When David regained consciousness, he was no longer in his study. The room he was in was dimly lit, its walls made of stone, cold and unyielding. He was sitting on a hard wooden chair, his hands bound with rope. Panic set in as he tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if they were not his own. He was no longer in London. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, something old enough to have witnessed the passing of centuries. David's head was spinning as he looked around. His surroundings were unfamiliar. He was inside what appeared to be a grand hall, though its grandeur had long since faded. The walls were covered in faded tapestries, their threads worn and frayed, as if they had once told stories of great importance. A large, ornate chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals cracked and dull. The floor beneath him was made of cold black marble, its surface cracked and worn from years of neglect. David stood unsteadily, his mind reeling. What was going on? How had he gotten here? A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man, wearing an elaborate black cloak that shimmered faintly in the low light, stepped forward. His face was obscured by a mask, half gold, half silver, its design intricate and alien. The man's eyes gleamed through the mask, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. David instinctively took a step back, his heart racing. "You're awake?" the man said, his voice smooth, almost melodic. "I had hoped you would be." David's mouth went dry. "Where am I? What is this place?" The masked man tilted his head slightly. You've crossed through the boundary. The tapestry has brought you here to the point where time itself is woven together. You are in the chamber of threads. David's mind raced. The chamber of threads. What does that mean? The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving David's. You are standing on the threshold of the weaving of time itself. The tapestry you hold in your hands is the key to understanding everything. The threads you see there are not just patterns, they are the connections between all moments in time, past, present, and future, all woven into one eternal tapestry. David's confusion deepened. But how can something like that be possible? The man reached into his cloak and produced a small silver thread, shimmering faintly in the dim light. The tapestry is a map of existence, a map of fate. Every thread represents a moment in time, an event that shapes the world. The tapestry you hold, it is the oldest of them all. It is the thread that connects everything. David stared at the thread, mesmerized by its delicate beauty. What do you want from me? The man's smile was cryptic. I want you to help us mend the fabric of time. You are the one chosen to do so. Before David could respond, the air around him shimmered again. The chamber of threads began to dissolve, the walls fading into a blur of color and light. The floor beneath him gave way, and the sensation of falling overwhelmed him. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. David found himself standing in a vast, open field. The sky was a deep, unbroken blue, and the air was fresh and crisp around him. The landscape stretched out in every direction, rolling hills, a distant forest, and a narrow stream winding through the land. It looked like a scene out of a dream, but there was something strange about it. As he looked closer, he noticed that the landscape was not quite real. It was as though it were a painting, beautiful, yet artificial. The colors were too vibrant, the lines too perfect. He reached out to touch a nearby tree, but his fingers passed through it as if it were made of mist. This is where time is born, came the voice of the masked man, now standing beside him. David turned to him, his breath catching in his throat. What is this place? The man's gaze was distant. This is the loom of eternity. This is where the threads are spun, where the moments of history are woven into the tapestry of time. David's mind was racing, and the tapestry, it controls everything. The man nodded. It doesn't just control time, it is time. But something is wrong. The threads are beginning to unravel. The timeline is fractured, and if it isn't repaired, everything will collapse. That's why you were brought here. You must help us stitch the fabric of time back together. David felt a weight settle over him. The task was monumental, and the stakes could not have been higher. But somehow, deep inside, he knew that this was his destiny. The tapestry was calling to him, pulling him into something far greater than he had ever imagined. But even as he stood there, looking at the loom of eternity, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The weaver's laughter echoed through the disintegrating loom, a sound like crumbling tombstones. David gripped the silver thread, the last unbroken strand, its light searing his palms. He could feel its power, raw and tamed, a storm of possibilities. This isn't just a thread, it's a lifeline. Pathetic, the weaver hissed, his form flickering between a man and a shadowy vortex. You think one fragile human can rewrite fate? David's muscles screamed as he channeled the thread's energy. I don't have to rewrite it, he spat. I just have to protect it. The loom shuddered. Fragments of timelines swirled around them. A medieval knight raising his sword, A scientist curing a plague, a child blowing out birthday candles. Each moment depended on the next. The masked man lunged at the weaver, his cloak dissolving into golden dust. Now David plunged the silver thread into the heart of the loom. Light erupted, blinding and pure. The weaver's scream split the air as the shadows binding him unraveled. But victory was fleeting. The loom's core began to collapse, sucking timelines into its vortex. David grabbed Eleanor's arm, dragging her away from the abyss. "We need to go now," she resisted, her eyes locked on the disintegrating threads. "My father's timeline, it's still there. I can save him." "No," David yanked her back as a chunk of the loom crumbled. "You'll die." The masked man materialized beside them, his form translucent. "The exits close in. Follow the threads." They ran, leaping over crumbling gaps in reality. Behind them, the weaver's roar faded, swallowed by the void. The world snapped back into focus. David found himself kneeling on the floor of his university office, sunlight streaming through dusty blinds. His hands trembled, but they were empty. No threads, no light, no blood. Was it all a hallucination? Then he saw it, a single golden thread, no thicker than a hair, coiled around his pinky finger. He touched it, and memories flooded back: the weaver's sorrow, Eleanor's tears, the weight of 1,000 histories on his shoulders. A knock startled him. Dr. Eleanor Voss stood in the doorway, her usual crisp lab coat replaced by a sweater. Her eyes red-rimmed. I remember," she whispered. David stood, the thread tightening around his finger. "So do I." Eleanor stepped inside, shutting the door. "The loom. It's still out there, isn't it? Broken, but not gone." David nodded. "And the weaver's still trapped in the collapse. For now. Then we have to fix it." Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steel. "Properly. No more shortcuts." David raised an eyebrow. "Last time you tried to fix things, you nearly ended reality." She flinched but held her ground. "I was wrong, but you can't do this alone. The threads, they're drawn to pain, to regret, and we've both got plenty." A notification chimed on David's computer. He clicked it open. A news article about a vanished WWI pilot suddenly reappearing, claiming he'd fallen through time. Eleanor leaned over his shoulder. "See, the cracks are already spreading." David closed his eyes. The thread pulsed, warm and insistent. "The tapestry guides you, all right," he said, "but we do it my way. No more needles, no more editing. We preserve the threads, all of them." Their first test came 3 days later. A hospital in 1987 Moscow flickered into existence in downtown Chicago. Ghostly overlay it. Concrete and steel. Civilians screamed as Soviet nurses in outdated uniforms rushed past them, oblivious. "Temporal overlap," Eleanor muttered, studying the anomaly through augmented reality glasses. 2 threads fused. David felt the loom's pull stronger now. He raised his hand, and a golden thread materialized, glowing like a sunbeam. "Stay close, and don't touch anything." They stepped through the hospital doors and into chaos. Patients in Soviet-era gowns wandered the halls, their faces blurred as static. A doctor shouted orders in Russian, unaware of the Chicago skyline visible through shattered windows. David's thread brightened, revealing a crimson strand tangled on a hospital bed. "Someone's altering the timeline here," he said. "Find the source, quickly." Eleanor scanned the room. There, the patient he wasn't supposed to survive, a young man, lay unconscious, his body flickering between solid and translucent. David grasped the crimson thread. Memories flooded him. Car crash avoided, a bullet dodged, a lifer written. His survival created a paradox. Eleanor said, "We have to stabilize it." David's hand shook. "How?" "Let the tapestry decide." He released the thread. It snapped taut, weaving itself into the loom's fabric. The hospital faded, leaving Chicago intact, but the victory felt hollow somewhere. The weaver laughed. Story 4. The Weight of Darkness. Sophie had always been an easy sleeper. She could fall asleep on a crowded train, during long road trips, or even in the middle of loud parties. Her friends often teased her about it, amazed at how effortlessly she could slip into slumber no matter the circumstances. Sleep had always been a refuge, a sanctuary, but recently, the one place she thought she could always find comfort had become a prison. The transformation had been subtle at first. Nights that once wrapped her in warmth and security now felt oppressive. A heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Sophie would lie down, eyes closed, and let herself drift into sleep, but it wasn't sleep she was seeking anymore. It was an escape, a desperate need to flee from the feeling of being suffocated, as if something invisible and malevolent had begun to cling to her very being. It began, like most things do, quietly. Sophie would wake up in the middle of the night, her body completely paralyzed, her breath shallow and ragged. She would try to move, to shift her limbs, or even to call out for help, but no sound escaped her lips. No movement followed her desperate attempts. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own body, unable to even blink. In those moments, the world around her seemed to stretch, distorted and alien, as though it had been swallowed by a vast, silent void. Panic would rise, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the suffocating stillness. At first, Sophie convinced herself that it was just a fluke, maybe the stress of her busy life as a graphic designer was catching up to her, or perhaps her recent move to a new apartment in an old, creaky building was messing with her sleep patterns. The walls groaned at night, the floorboards shifted, and sometimes the wind howled through the gaps in the windows. It made sense that these noises might play tricks on her mind, especially when she was exhausted. But as the episodes grew more frequent, Sophie's doubt began to erode. She couldn't ignore it any longer, the feeling of being watched, of something else being present in the room with her, the fear not at her, constantly hovering just beneath the surface of her thoughts. One night, after another sleepless evening, Sophie found herself lying wide-eyed in her dark bedroom. The clock on her nightstand read 3:15 a.m. The faint glow from the digits was the only light in the room, casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, distant and muffled, as though it were coming from a place far removed from her own reality. Sophie shifted uncomfortably under the covers, trying to find a position that would allow her to rest, but it was impossible. Every inch of her body seemed to ache, as if the weight of the room itself had begun to press down on her. The air was thick, cold, and heavy, suffocating. It wasn't the same comforting stillness she used to enjoy. No, this was different. This felt wrong. Then, just as Sophie was about to give in to the exhaustion pulling at her, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The weight in the air grew even more oppressive, as if it were pressing her down, flattening her into the bed. Her chest tightened, and she could feel the breath leaving her body, leaving her suffocated, trapped in this stifling stillness. She gasped, trying to draw in a breath, but it felt as though the very air had been sucked from the room. Panic surged through her veins, her heart racing in her chest. But her body remained frozen, helpless. A whisper of fabric brushing against the floor cut through the silence, followed by a low, guttural growl so deep and primal that it vibrated through her bones. Sophie's body stiffened, her senses on high alert. The sound came from the corner of the room just beyond the edge of her vision. The shadows there seemed to twist and writhe, growing and shifting like some living, breathing thing. The fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks now surged like a tidal wave, swallowing her whole. Sophie's eyes darted toward the corner of the room, her breath hitching. She couldn't see anything, nothing, but the shadows, but she could feel it. Something was there. Something was watching her, lurking just out of sight. Her pulse quickened, each beat now a drumbeat in the suffocating silence. The growl grew louder, more pronounced. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her skin crawling as the air grew colder. And then came the whispers, not just one, but a chorus of voices, all speaking in low, dissonant murmurs, their words garbled and incomprehensible. They seemed to blend together, twisting in the air like a toxic fog. But then, one word cut through the cacophony, clear as day. Suffocate. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as a figure began to emerge from the shadows at the foot of her bed. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and distorted, stretching toward her like the fingers of some ancient, monstrous being. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Its face was obscured by darkness, but she could feel its eyes cold, empty and hollow, staring into her soul. It was as if the very darkness itself had manifested into a form, a physical embodiment of her deepest fears. She wanted to scream. She wanted to beg for help, but her throat was tight, constricted by an invisible force. Her vocal cords refused to obey. All she could do was watch in paralyzed terror as the figure moved closer, its grotesque form becoming clearer with each passing second. The room around her seemed to warp, the walls bending and distorting, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting under the weight of its presence. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, their meaning slipping through her mind like oil through water. She could no longer make out the words, but the feeling behind them was clear. This was it. This was the end. And then the figure lunged at her, its hand cold and unnatural, wrapped around her throat, squeezing with a strength that defied reason. Sophie's vision blurred, her chest constricting as if the air had turned to liquid. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and her body fought to take in air. But there was no escape. The darkness was closing in, smothering her, consuming her. Just when she thought she would lose consciousness, just when the last vestiges of her breath were slipping away, everything stopped. The pressure on her chest lifted. The suffocating weight that had pressed against her for what felt like hours disappeared. Sophie gasped, her lungs burning as she drew in air, her body trembling from the aftershock. The figure was gone. Room was still. The clock on her nightstand ticked away, marking the passage of time as though nothing had happened. But Sophie knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The following days were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and dread. Sophie couldn't escape the feeling that the entity was still there, waiting, watching her. She tried to talk to her friends about it, but they just laughed it off. They told her she was overworked, stressed, that it was just a series of nightmares, brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. But Sophie knew the truth. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't something her mind had created. No, this was real. Each night, she would lie awake, terrified to fall asleep. The oppressive silence in her apartment felt like a tangible thing creeping into her bones, making it impossible to relax. She would stare at the ceiling, counting the seconds as they ticked by. And yet, despite her best efforts, fatigue would always win, and she would fall into a fitful sleep. And each time she woke, the figure would be there. Sometimes it would stand at the foot of her bed, looming over her like a dark specter. Other times it would whisper her name, the sound grating like nails on a chalkboard. It never spoke clearly, only fragments, disjointed phrases that didn't make sense, but Sophie could feel them twisting her mind, warping her reality. One night, Sophie made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. She would stay awake, no matter what. She stared at the clock, watching the minutes tick by, feeling the weight of the room press in on her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward her, their forms shifting and writhing. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath misting in front of her face. Then came the growl, low, grating, and the whisper, "You can't escape." Sophie's heart stopped in her chest. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. But she knew it was there, just behind her, just out of sight. The pressure on her chest returned, heavier than before, as if the very darkness were crushing her. But this time, Sophie fought back. With every ounce of strength she had left, she screamed. A primal scream that tore from her throat, raw and desperate. And in that moment, everything stopped. The growl ceased. The darkness receded. The weight lifted. Sophie opened her eyes. The figure was gone. But as she lay there trembling, she knew the truth. The darkness hadn't left her. It was still there, lurking, waiting for the next time she would slip into sleep, waiting for the moment when it would claim her once again. Sophie thought she could outrun it. She told herself that if she just stayed awake long enough, if she fought back hard enough, the darkness would eventually retreat. It would stop chasing her. But as the days wore on, Sophie began to realize that the thing that haunted her, this presence, this suffocating shadow, wasn't something she could escape. It wasn't just waiting for her to sleep. It was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every moment she spent in terror. Her life began to unravel in ways she hadn't imagined possible. She found it harder and harder to concentrate at work. The simple task of staring at her computer screen became unbearable. The blinking cursor on the blank page seemed to mock her, reminding her that time was passing, and with every passing minute she was closer to the inevitable sleep. The exhaustion was starting to show. Her skin looked pale, her eyes hollow. From restless nights, she would stumble through her daily routine, barely able to keep up appearances, all the while haunted by the knowledge that when the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness would come again. Sophie didn't dare tell anyone about the figure. She tried once to explain the suffocating presence that lurked in her bedroom, but the look on her friend's face, the polite concern mixed with disbelief, had been enough to silence her. They said she was overworked, that stress could manifest in strange ways. "You're just tired, Sophie. It happens to everyone," they'd say. But Sophie knew it wasn't just exhaustion. This was something deeper, something darker. Her isolation grew. She no longer felt like herself. The terror had crept into every part of her life. She couldn't escape the feeling that the shadows were watching her, hovering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was like a constant hum in the back of her mind, a low, relentless noise that she couldn't escape. It was becoming harder to tell where the dream ended and reality began. One night, Sophie made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this. She had tried staying awake, forcing herself to be alert at all hours, but the exhaustion was making her weak. Her eyelids felt like they weighed 100 pounds. The exhaustion was swallowing her from the inside, and Sophie couldn't fight it any longer. But there was another option, wasn't there? She thought of something darker, something desperate. She would confront it. That night, Sophie resolved to stay awake as long as she could, but not just in a passive way. She was going to force herself to stay alert. She would sit up in her bed, eyes wide open, focusing on the clock as the minutes ticked by. She wasn't going to let the shadows take her. She couldn't. She couldn't bear the thought of being consumed by it again. As the night dragged on, Sophie could feel the pull of sleep growing stronger. Her body ached, her mind foggy, but she resisted. She kept her focus sharp. The shadows in her room seemed to stretch and grow longer as the hours passed, twisting with an unnatural rhythm. She felt their cold touch against her skin, the air thickening with each passing moment. It wasn't long before she heard the familiar growl. The low rumbling sound seemed to vibrate through the walls of her apartment, shaking her to her very core. It started as a soft rumble in the distance, like the sound of a far-off storm. But then it came closer, growing louder, more pronounced. Sophie felt the hairs on her neck stand up as she sat frozen in bed, her eyes locked on the corner of the room where she knew the figure would appear. She refused to turn her head. She had to see it first. She had to know what it was before it consumed her. The growl became a low hiss, then a guttural snarl. Sophie's heart raced. The room felt smaller, the shadows closer. She knew it was there, standing just out of sight, waiting for her to let her guard down. She was terrified, but she was also angry. Angry at herself for letting this thing, whatever it was, take control of her life. The air grew colder. The weight returned to her chest, pressing down harder than before. Sophie gasped, trying to breathe, but it felt like her lungs were filled with concrete. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and she could see her breath as if the room had been frozen over. Sophie clenched her fists, her body trembling. The pressure was overwhelming. Her limbs felt as though they were being crushed, pulled down into the mattress. The suffocating force that had gripped her for so long was here again. The whispers began, rising in volume, as if the darkness itself was speaking to her. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed, its words like jagged nails scraping across her mind. Sophie's chest tightened. She was so close to the edge. The darkness had already swallowed the room, and yet the shadows still held her in their grip, tightening their hold with every passing second. The whispers became clearer now, the syllables forming actual words she could understand. Suffocate. The figure was there now, standing at the foot of her bed. It was taller than before, its form shifting and warping with every blink of her eyes. Sophie's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the thing before her. She couldn't see its face, but she felt its eyes, cold, empty voids that seemed to reach into her soul. She wanted to look away, to run, but her body was paralyzed. She couldn't move. The whispers grew louder, urgent. "It's too late." Sophie's heartbeat pounded in her ears. The pressure increased. She could feel it now, its hands on her, its fingers reaching for her throat. She struggled, but it was no use. She couldn't break free from the suffocating weight that held her down. For a moment, Sophie thought she might die, that the figure would finish what it had started, that she would be swallowed by the very darkness she had been running from. Her vision began to blur, her senses fading as the world around her dissolved into a void of emptiness. But then something shifted. Sophie didn't know what it was, whether it was her desperation or some primal instinct. But she found a burst of strength deep inside her. Her fingers twitched, her arms jerked. With every ounce of strength, she forced herself to move. She screamed, a cry so loud, so raw it seemed to shatter the very walls around her. The growl stopped. The whispers ceased. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. Sophie's body trembled, her heart racing as she gasped for air. The pressure lifted from her chest, and the weight of the darkness faded away. She had done it. She had fought back. But as Sophie opened her eyes, breathing heavily, she saw the room was empty. The figure was gone. The shadows returned to their normal shapes, stretching across the walls. The clock on her nightstand ticked, the silence of the room feeling deafening. In its absence, Sophie felt her body give way as the adrenaline drained from her, leaving her physically exhausted and mentally drained. She thought it was over. But even as she lay there, her body heavy with exhaustion, Sophie knew the truth. The darkness hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when she would slip again, waiting for the next time she would fall asleep to drag her back into the depths. The shadows lingered, but Sophie didn't let herself believe they were gone. She couldn't afford to. The moment of victory had been fleeting, but in it she found something she hadn't realized. She needed hope. Even if the darkness came for her again, even if it never let go, Sophie now knew she had the strength to fight. The next night, she didn't wait for it to come to her. She got out of bed, standing tall in the middle of the room. The shadows still moved in the corners of her vision, and she could hear the faintest of growls. But Sophie didn't back down. She was ready. She had to be. And as the darkness closed in, Sophie braced herself. The fight was far from over. Story 5, The Call of the Dead. In the small, quiet town of Hollowbrook, nestled on the edge of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, things had always been peaceful. The townspeople were friendly, the streets quiet, and the air fresh with the scent of pine. Life was slow and predictable. But all of that changed the day Evelyn Harper was found dead. It was a cold, overcast morning when the sheriff's department received the call. The phone rang sharply in the otherwise silent office of Sheriff Bob Caldwell, a sound that felt more ominous than it had any right to be. Sheriff Caldwell had been in Hollowbrook for over 2 decades. He had seen his share of mischief, the occasional domestic dispute, and the odd drunken fight at the local bar, but nothing like this. Evelyn Harper had been a beloved local historian, known for her extensive knowledge of the town's dark past. She spent her days at the town library, poring over dusty books and maps, researching the strange happenings that dotted Hollowbrook's history, from mysterious disappearances to the local legends of spirits that roamed the hills. Evelyn knew it all. Her eccentric personality had earned her a certain charm among the townspeople, but she was often viewed as a bit peculiar. Still, no one ever thought much of it. She was harmless, eccentric, and everyone in town adored her. But now she was gone, found lifeless in her home, a single knife wound to the chest. No signs of forced entry, no robbery, no apparent motive, just a brutal murder that made no sense. The town, known for its slow pace and peaceful nature, was now shaken to its very core. The sheriff's office was in turmoil. They had never seen anything like this in Hollowbrook before. No one had ever dared bring violence to the quiet streets of the town. The police were stumped. They had no leads, no suspects. The whole situation felt wrong, as though something bigger and more insidious was lurking just beneath the surface. That evening, just after sunset, a strange visitor appeared at the sheriff's office. Her name was Claire Blackwood. Claire was the town's local medium, a woman with a reputation for communicating with spirits. She was well known, but many of the townspeople were skeptical of her abilities. Some believed she truly had the gift to connect with the dead, while others considered her nothing more than a charlatan preying on the gullible. However, there was something about Claire that made people uneasy. She had an aura that couldn't be ignored, an air of mystery that clung to her. Sheriff Caldwell had heard rumors about Claire over the years, but had never thought much of it. He was a pragmatic man, a man of facts and reason, and he was always cautious about buying into supernatural claims. But that evening, as Claire stood before him in the sheriff's office, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something extraordinary was about to unfold. "I need to speak to the sheriff," Claire said with quiet urgency in her voice. Her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She wasn't like the usual visitors. He had to deal with drunks, troublemakers, and annoyed citizens. Claire was different. Sheriff Caldwell regarded her carefully, his brow furrowed. He had seen many things in his time, but a medium was something new. Skepticism ran deep in his veins, but there was something in her presence that made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, the way her eyes seemed to see straight through him, or maybe it was the strange silence in the room. Something felt off. "I know who killed Evelyn Harper," Claire said flatly, her words sharp as knives. The sheriff stared at her, disbelief clouding his features. "What do you mean, you know? How could you possibly know that?" "I can speak to the dead, Sheriff," Claire replied, her voice calm but heavy with something unspoken. "And Evelyn, she's trying to reach you. She wants justice. She wants you to know who did this to her." The sheriff froze. He had heard stories about Claire, about how she would hold seances and claim to contact spirits. But he never thought for a second that any of it was real. And now she was standing before him, claiming she knew the identity of Evelyn's killer. "You've got to be kidding me." Sheriff Caldwell muttered under his breath, "This is insane." Claire didn't seem bothered by his reaction. She stood there unblinking, as if waiting for him to make up his mind. "I know it sounds unbelievable, but Evelyn is here, and she's reaching out for you." The sheriff, still skeptical but intrigued by the strange energy in the air, decided to play along. "All right," he said slowly. "Show me, if you can. Truly talk to Evelyn, then let's see it. I want to hear it for myself." Claire nodded and turned, leading him out of the office. They drove in silence through the winding streets of Hollowbrook, the town now shrouded in the heavy veil of evening. The wind howled through the trees, and the sky above them seemed to be thickening with clouds, casting an eerie glow over the world below. They arrived at Claire's small house on the outskirts of town. It was a modest, unassuming home, but as they stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The air was thick with incense, and the faint sound of wind chimes could be heard in the background. The room was dimly lit by the flickering light of a dozen candles, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Shelves were cluttered with strange trinkets, old books, and glass jars filled with herbs and crystals. It looked like the kind of place you'd expect from someone who claimed to communicate with spirits. It was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Claire sat down in front of an old, worn table. The sheriff hesitated but followed suit. He could feel the hairs on his neck stand up as he looked around the room. It felt as if something unseen was watching him. Claire closed her eyes, and for a moment everything went still. The silence was suffocating. The sheriff glanced around nervously, waiting for something, anything to happen. The candles flickered once, twice, before suddenly flaring up brighter than before. "I'm going to try to reach her, Claire," said, her voice low. She placed her hands on the table and then began to chant in a language the sheriff didn't recognize. It was soft, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The room seemed to grow colder, and the air around them seemed to thicken. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, pulling in the corners of the room. A faint, distant sound echoed in the room, a low, mournful hum. It was as if the very walls were breathing. Sheriff Caldwell's pulse quickened. Suddenly, Claire's voice shifted. It was no longer her voice. It was softer, more distant, and yet undeniably familiar. It was a voice from beyond. "She's here," Claire said, her voice now echoing with an otherworldly resonance. The sheriff's heart skipped a beat. "Evelyn, yes?" The voice responded, a soft whisper, like a memory. "I'm here, Sheriff Caldwell. I need your help." The sheriff froze, his blood turning cold. It was Evelyn's voice, unmistakable. His heart raced as he struggled to find words. How are you?" There was no one at the door. Evelyn's voice continued, her tone filled with a quiet sadness. "No one saw me. No one heard me. But you must find the one who did this to me." The sheriff's eyes widened. "But how? How do we find out who did this?" "Listen," Evelyn's voice urged. "The one who killed me is close. Someone from your town, someone you know." The sheriff's mind raced. Who could it be? He had lived in Hollowbrook his entire life. He knew everyone. Who could have done this? Evelyn's voice grew more urgent. "You have to look at the history. The past always comes back. Follow the trail. The answers are hidden in the town's oldest stories." Sheriff Caldwell's head was spinning. Could it be true? Was Evelyn really trying to tell him something? The past old stories, what did that have to do with her death? "The library," Evelyn's voice said, her words growing fainter. "Start with the oldest records, the ones that were hidden. They'll lead you to the truth." Before the sheriff could ask another question, the presence vanished. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the air seemed to settle. The candles flickered once more before returning to their usual steady glow. Claire opened her eyes, looking drained but calm. "I've done my part," Claire said softly. "Now it's up to you." The sheriff didn't speak for a long moment. He was still processing what had just happened. Could it be? Was it possible that the dead had reached out to him for help? He glanced at Claire, and then back at the table, his mind spinning. "Thank you," he said finally, though he wasn't sure if he was thanking her for her help or simply for giving him something, anything to go on. Claire simply nodded and stood up. "It's just the beginning, Sheriff. Don't forget the past. It always catches up with us." Sheriff Bob Caldwell sat in his patrol car, staring at the mansion looming before him. The night was thick with fog, the lights from the mansion casting long, distorted shadows on the gravel path leading to its massive front doors. Hollowbrook had always been a town of secrets, a town that hid its skeletons in the closet, locking them away where no one would dare look. But now Sheriff Caldwell had gone far past the closets. He had found the bones, and he wasn't going to stop until he unearthed the truth. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the rearview mirror, his mind replaying the details of his conversation with Claire Blackwood earlier that night. The paranormal connection, the cryptic message from Evelyn Harper, the chilling whisper of the spirits still echoing in his mind. Looked to the past. It all pointed to something far darker than Caldwell had ever anticipated. Evelyn's death hadn't been a random act of violence. No, it was carefully planned, and it was connected to something far more sinister. He knew that much for sure. The town's past was filled with shadows, But there was one figure in particular that kept surfacing in his mind, Hank McAllister. The name had haunted Caldwell since he'd first discovered it in Evelyn's journal. McAllister, the wealthy businessman who held the strings of Hollowbrook's economy and its politics. Caldwell had always suspected that something about McAllister was off. But now, with everything pointing to him, Caldwell couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The man was hiding something, and tonight Sheriff Caldwell was determined to confront him. He stepped out of his car, the chill of the night air biting at his skin as he approached the mansion. The path to the front door was lined with high hedges, their sharp edges like sentinels guarding the secrets within. As he reached the door, he could almost feel the oppressive weight of the darkness inside. This was no ordinary house. It was the very embodiment of Hollowbrook's history, one of power, manipulation, and death. With a deep breath, Sheriff Caldwell knocked. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Hank McAllister standing in the threshold. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his face a picture of practiced calm. But Caldwell noticed the slight twitch of his jaw, sign of unease. Sheriff Caldwell, McAllister greeted with a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. To what do I owe the pleasure? I need to speak with you about Evelyn Harper, Caldwell said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet menace. I think you know more than you're letting on. McAllister's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered, his posture straightening. Evelyn, tragic, isn't it? But I assure you, Sheriff, I have no idea what you could possibly want from me on this matter. Sheriff Caldwell's gaze never wavered. I think you do. I think you know exactly what happened to her, and I think you know who killed her. McAllister's eyes narrowed for a moment, the full weight of politeness slipping just slightly. Sheriff, you're out of your depth here. You've been chasing ghosts and rumors. It's a dangerous game, one that could cost you more than you realize. The threat in McAllister's words was unmistakable, but Caldwell wasn't intimidated. He had heard worse, seen worse, and tonight he would uncover the truth. You don't scare me, McAllister, he said, his voice low and firm. I'm not here to back down. I've been digging into the town's past, into Evelyn's research. I know about the cult, the one that you and others have been hiding for generations. McAllister's face grew darker, and for a fleeting second Caldwell saw the mask of power crack. But just as quickly it was gone. You're making a terrible mistake, McAllister said, his tone now cold and threatening. I would suggest you leave before things get out of hand. People in this town don't ask questions that they don't want answered. But Caldwell stood his ground. I've already asked the questions, and I'll keep asking until I have the answers. A tense silence filled the air between them, and for a moment it felt as though the whole world had stopped spinning. Caldwell could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. But there was no turning back now. He had already crossed the line. I know about the cult, Caldwell said again, his voice unwavering. That one that worshipped spirits, the one that used the power of the dead to manipulate the living. It's been hidden for years, buried in the past, but it's alive, McAllister. It's alive, and I know you're part of it. McAllister's eyes flashed with a dangerous intensity, and his lips curled into a knowing smirk. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Sheriff. Some things are better left buried. Some things are better left undisturbed. You don't get to decide that, Caldwell shot back. Evelyn was about to expose everything. She was getting too close, and you knew that. So you killed her to silence her. You killed her because she was getting too close to the truth. McAllister stepped forward, his imposing presence now inches from Caldwell. "You're wrong. Evelyn wasn't killed because she was close to the truth. She was killed because she didn't understand the truth, and you won't understand it either. But you're about to learn the hard way." Before Caldwell could react, McAllister turned, gesturing for him to follow. "Come with me, Sheriff. If you're determined to die for the truth, then you'll want to see it with your own eyes." With little choice, Caldwell followed McAllister into the mansion. The interior was just as Caldwell had imagined, opulent, cold, and filled with an unsettling aura. The walls were adorned with paintings of long-dead ancestors, their eyes watching as Caldwell moved deeper into the house. It felt as though the very air had thickened, the weight of the house's history pressing in on him from all sides. They descended into the basement, where McAllister stopped in front of an old wooden door. "This is where it all began," McAllister said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where the darkness was born." Caldwell's pulse quickened as McAllister opened the door. Inside, the room was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting long shadows on the walls. At the center of the room was an altar, stained with something Caldwell didn't want to identify. The walls were lined with symbols, strange, cryptic markings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "This is what Evelyn was trying to uncover," McAllister said, his voice reverberating in the silence. "This is the power that the cult has protected for centuries. The power to control the dead, the power to bend the will of those who have crossed over." Caldwell's mind raced as he took in the horrifying sight before him. It was everything he had feared and more. The cult had been using the spirits to manipulate the town, to control its people. Its future, its very fate, Evelyn had uncovered this dark secret, and it had cost her life. But as Caldwell stepped closer to the altar, something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped, and a cold, ghostly breeze blew through the room. A soft whisper, almost inaudible, echoed in his mind. "You cannot stop it." Suddenly, Caldwell was overwhelmed with a vision of Evelyn, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes wide with fear. She was standing in front of the altar, her mouth moving, but no sound came out. Behind her, shadowy figures began to emerge from the walls, their forms twisted and unnatural. They reached out toward her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. Then, in an instant, the vision was gone, and Caldwell was back in the room, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. "I told you," McAllister's voice was low, almost amused. "You can't stop it, Sheriff. You've already crossed the line. Now there's no going back." Caldwell swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had to stop this, he had to stop McAllister, and whatever this cult was, before it consumed Hollowbrook completely. But he knew now that it wouldn't be easy. The truth was darker and more powerful than he could have ever imagined. "I'll stop you," Caldwell said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "And I'll bring this town's secrets into the light." McAllister smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of someone who had already won. And as Caldwell turned to leave, he realized the chilling truth. Hollowbrook wasn't just a town with secrets. It was a town ruled by them, and breaking its hold on the truth would be the hardest battle of his life. And that, my friends, marks the end of another spine-tingling journey into the unknown. If this story has sent chills down your spine, the way it did ours, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback fuels the darkness and keeps us going. If you're new to the channel, don't just stand there in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a thrilling tale. We've got a collection of eerie stories waiting just for you. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's lurking around the corner. Thank you for joining us tonight. Stay curious, stay brave. And remember, our next adventure is always just a heartbeat away. Until then, keep those whispers close and your lights dim.